it's at the end, what the fourth industrial revolution will lead to is a fusion of our physical, our digital, and our biological identities. When I wrote the book, I started to write it for years ago. It was published 3 years ago. It was sold, very interesting, over 1 million times in the world. And what is interesting is that 800,000 copies, more than 800,000 copies of those 2 million were sold in 3 countries alone: China, Japan, and South Korea. And you may be interested, who was the biggest buyer with 16,000 copies at the same time? It was the Korean military. Because the fourth industrial revolution will have a major impact also on warfare.
Thank you, Bill. Let me now turn to you, Bill Gates, and you are also the founder of Breakthrough Energy. Bill Winters just mentioned technology, and we know that nature-based solutions are going to be a critical part of the solution to achieving net zero. But what else is needed?
Well, I'd say the good news is that a lot of companies are taking carbon into account as they make decisions. They have, some per ton hurdle price, and they, are going to stay away from investments that, are generating carbon because of that price signal. The big step, the next step there is getting people to monetize those things. And put that money into things that are provably have an impact. And a number of companies now are willing to do that. Now, some of these offsets are very complicated. Trees, for example, have a 40-year lifetime on average. So to match the carbon residency time, you'd have to replant 250 times. And trees generally grow where there's good soil and good water. And so the number of places where you can do those 250 plantings is very, very small. So, over time, the understanding and the quality of these efforts will go up. As I went to do offsets for myself personally, long-term offsets, the prices were about $400 a ton. That's very, very high. And everything we think of here, it's 51 billion tons of emissions. And so everything has to be considered as a percentage of that. For a company that's a electric utility, a steel company, a cement company, any sort of industrial thing, you see the increase in price that they'd have to have is still significant. So innovation is going to be key to this as we do the carbon markets in parallel with funding the innovation activities.
I'm going to talk today about energy and climate. And that might seem a bit surprising because my full-time work at the Foundation is mostly about vaccines and seeds, about the things that we need to invent and deliver to help the poorest 2 billion live better lives. We need to meet a new constraint, and that constraint has to do with CO2. CO2 is warming the planet, and the equation on CO2 is actually a very straightforward one. If you sum up the CO2 that gets emitted, that leads to a temperature increase. And that temperature increase leads to some very negative effects. The effects on the weather, perhaps worse, the indirect effects in that the natural ecosystems can't adjust to these rapid changes, and so you get ecosystem collapses. Now, the exact amount of how you map from a certain increase in of CO2 to what temperature will be and where the positive feedbacks are, there's some uncertainty there, but not very much. And there's certainly uncertainty about how bad those effects will be, but they will be extremely bad. I asked the top scientists on this several times, do we really have to get down to near zero? Can't we just, cut it in half or a quarter? And the answer is that until we get near to zero, the temperature will continue to rise. And so that's a big challenge. It's very different than saying, we're a 12-foot high truck trying to get under a 10-foot bridge and we can just sort of squeeze under. This is something that has to get to zero. Now, we put out a lot of carbon dioxide every year, over 26 billion tons. For each American, it's about 20 tons. For people in poor countries, it's less than 1 ton. It's an average about 5 tons for everyone on the planet. And somehow we have to make changes that will bring that down to zero. It's been constantly going up. It's only various economic changes that have even flattened it at all. So we have to go from rapidly rising to falling and falling all the way to zero. This equation has 4 factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero. And that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra. But let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. But there we see an increase of about 1.3.
President-elect Joe Biden is weeks away from taking office, but his presidency already has a growing conspiracy following it. It is called the Great Reset. The theory accuses Mr. Biden of playing a part in a global economic plan that will ultimately lead to a dystopian society. The theory even calls Mr. Biden's campaign slogan, "Build Back Better," a front for the conspiracy. To talk more about the so-called Great Reset, we have CBSN technology reporter Dan Patterson. Hi, Dan. Boy, the conspiracy theories are coming fast and furious these days. I can't keep up. So can you explain how the Great Reset conspiracy started and where this phrase actually came from?
Yeah, so this is kind of a mishmash of a number of different conspiracy theories, Tanya, and they all kind of borrow from each other, and some of them have been floating around since the very early days of the pandemic. So the conspiracy alleges an end to global capitalism and a post-apocalyptic future where those who resist the COVID vaccine will be imprisoned. It borrows or takes from Biden's Build Back Better campaign and then kind of amalgamates it with a conspiracy theory about Bill Gates and his plans to vaccinate and track everyone with a secret tracker, along with part of a New World Order conspiracy run by the World Economic Forum, who actually have COVID response white papers, policy papers written called the Great Reset. Now, this had nothing to do with the conspiracy, but they kind of took all of those components and mashed it together into this uber conspiracy. The ironic part is, if you've never heard of the World Economic Forum, it's a small think tank organization that publishes white papers and policy papers, and they throw events and conferences. One of their events in Davos every year features speakers who are often world leaders or corporate leaders. When you walk through Davos, it's almost impossible to find a socialist. These are some of the preeminent capitalists in the world. So it's a really interesting conspiracy that is kind of evolving in the face of reality.
Right. It's interesting that the leap went from, the World Economic Forum that, as you said, sort of celebrates capitalism on one level to, creating this capitalism on one level to creating this theory that's going to bring it down on a global level.
And obviously you are a champion of multilateralism, a multi-stakeholder society. With the departure of Donald Trump, as we were just talking about, do you see this now injecting new momentum into a multilateral system, a global multilateral system? And would we return to the traditional multilateralism, do you think? Or is the world on a new path?
I think also here we need a reset. We cannot go back to the system of multilateralism which we have established after World War II. What we need is a reform of the international system. Just think of the WTO. We have to integrate the new dimensions of global trade, like everything which has to do with e-commerce and so on. So definitively, multilateralism will get a boost by the election of President Biden. And I'm very hopeful that we can now create the necessary systems which we need for the 21st century.
Good to talk to you, Professor Schwab. Many thanks for joining us on the Global Conversation.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. Before we hit the Great Reset button, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you click the like button, it convinces YouTube to show this video to more people. So, if you've been paying attention to those really rich people at the World Economic Forum talking about how great they are, or if you've been going down the 4chan rabbit hole, you may have heard of this concept, the Great Reset. It works like this. The world economy has been broken because of the coronavirus, and to fix it, we have to turn the economy off and then back on again. Okay, it's not actually like pressing a big reset button, like some stock images would have you believe. It's more like this.
And moving forward, you should expect the government to take a more active role in the economy and in societal issues.
The idea of a Great Reset has been around for years, but it really started to gain traction back in June 2020, when the World Economic Forum officially announced their Great Reset initiative. They write, there is an urgent need for global stakeholders to cooperate in simultaneously managing the direct consequences of the COVID-19 crisis. Even if you haven't heard of the World Economic Forum, you've probably heard of Davos, which is their annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland. It's where more than 3,000 business leaders, politicians, prominent activists, and others meet to talk about how they're making the world a better place, in their opinion. It's basically Burning Man for the global elite. Davos partners include some of the biggest companies in the world, like Alibaba, Google, Goldman Sachs, Huawei, BlackRock, JP Morgan Chase, McKinsey, Citi, Coca-Cola, Microsoft, Facebook. You get the picture. The last Davos summit happened in January this year, just as the coronavirus was spreading around the world. And there's no doubt that the coronavirus has caused a crisis. More than one, actually. Thanks to the Chinese government's initial 6-week cover-up, the coronavirus spread around the world, infecting people in every country. More than 1 million people have died worldwide. The other crisis is the economic devastation. As governments around the world followed the Chinese Communist Party's lockdown model, small businesses were forced to close, and job loss has skyrocketed. So with these twin crises caused by the Chinese and other governments' response to the coronavirus, what can be done? Well, the World Economic Forum has a solution, the Great Reset. This is not the first time the World Economic Forum has come up with a grand-sounding global solution, the kind that, depending on your point of view, sounds either inspirational or terrifying. Like when they talked about globalization 4.0 shaping a new global architecture in the age of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, or creating a shared future in a fractured world, or the Great Transformation. With names like these, I'm surprised people weren't scared of the World Economic Forum until now. So back to this year's Great Reset initiative. The World Economic Forum is strangely short on details of how it would actually work. That's probably why it's led to so many conspiracy theories. But while the Great Reset is openly talked about, there's surprisingly little information on specific programs, or how much money ought to be allocated to what. So at this point, it's just vague, big picture stuff. For example, they say governments should implement long overdue reforms that promote more equitable outcomes. Depending on the country, these may include changes to wealth taxes, the withdrawal of fossil fuel subsidies, and new rules governing intellectual property, trade, and competition. Okay, so the solution to the crises caused by government is more government intervention. Intervention that has nothing to do with the coronavirus. It's almost as if governments want to use the coronavirus as an excuse to do the things they had been planning to do anyway. So obviously, the kind of conservative folk who want small government, low taxes, and property rights are not too happy about that agenda. They don't want a small group of elites at the World Economic Forum rewriting the rules of the economy or giving governments an excuse to become more powerful with more control over the economy. But it's more than that. The World Economic Forum says we must build entirely new foundations for our economic and social systems. They don't explain what that means, which has led some people to compare it to the Communist Manifesto, because it sounds a bit like the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. But while the World Economic Forum's promises of a Great Reset may sound like a communist love fest, the far left is not going to love it either. I'll explain why after the break. Welcome back. The World Economic Forum is proposing a Great Reset, one that promises more equity and inclusion. It may be pandering to the political left, but that doesn't mean the political left is actually going to like it. Keep in mind that the main groups that have been protesting the World Economic Forum for decades have been on the far left, from fiery climate activists, to anti-globalists, to straight-up communists. Folks on the left typically don't like a small group of rich capitalists at the World Economic Forum dictating policy for the rest of us. Rich capitalists like Prince Charles from the British monarchy, Larry Fink from BlackRock Multinational Investment Company, and George Soros from all the conspiracy theories. So really, the Great Reset is something ordinary people on the left and right see as a potential problem. A small group of rich, powerful elite influencing governments to change the rules of the economy. And while the World Economic Forum has been short on details, here's an example of what the world could look like after a Great Reset, from an article published by the World Economic Forum 4 years ago. It imagines life in the year 2030, where everything is digitized and everyone has free, unlimited access to clean energy somehow. I don't own anything. I don't own a car. I don't own a house. I don't own any appliances or any clothes. That sounds like abject poverty, but it's totally not. The article is suggesting that you don't need to own anything because you can just get everything for free as a service. We have access to transportation, accommodation, food, and all the things we need in our daily lives. One by one, all these things became free, so it ended up not making sense for us to own much. If that sounds like a beautiful utopia to you, think about it in a historical context. Remember all the governments that promised free stuff? In China, Mao Zedong promised land to the tillers, but as soon as he rose to power, he ended up killing the landlords and forcing people to work on collective farms. Soon, millions of people starved to death. Well, except for the wealthy elite. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez promised to eradicate poverty. But within 2 decades, he had turned a nation that was unequal but prosperous into a nation where everyone was equal, equally poor, and can barely afford food. Well, except for the wealthy elite. Governments that promised equality and free stuff have always ended up taking away people's money and property rights, from the Soviet Union to Cuba to Zaire. Wait, but how about the Nordic countries that are touted as great models of socialism? The secret is, they're not socialist. The Nordic countries all made free market reforms in the late 20th century because their economies were crashing under the weight of big government. Now, they all have free markets, private business, and ensure strong property rights. And let's look at Norway, which has the highest GDP per capita. Their secret to economic success? It starts with massive oil extraction, and then they invest oil money in stock markets in other countries. So basically, Norway pays for its big social programs through oil and capitalism, not through green energy and equity. So, back at the World Economic Forum, when they talk about so-called equity, and when they talk about a green recovery, keep in mind, this is being said by a small group of elite billionaires who are flying to their meeting in Davos on thousands of private jets. When they talk about a great reset, do you think they really want equality for everyone? Seriously, who on earth would put their hopes for a greener and more equitable world in the hands of governments and the wealthy elite? Do you think that will benefit everyone? Or do you think it'll benefit the governments and the wealthy elite? Sure, they still haven't given us any details on what the Great Reset actually is. But I know one thing. If it happens, the rest of us are not going to like it. But the real question is, will it actually happen? Are governments and multinational corporations actually pushing for a Great Reset? Or is it just inspirational/terrifying marketing speak for people who go to the World Economic Forum to feel good about themselves? After all, the World Economic Forum has been using similar language to the Great Reset for years. Like here, where they talk about how the underlying systems are broken and a major rethink needs to take place to move in the right direction to realize a global vision for a more sustainable and inclusive growth model for the world and future generations. That's from their Great Transformation theme back in 2012. And it reminds me of the time I forgot to finish an English paper in college and ended up staying up all night to turn my 2-page essay into a 10-page essay, with the help of lots and lots of Red Bull. My point is that the World Economic Forum's rhetoric sounds great, but it says nothing. And that's probably the best case scenario.
My name is Greta Thunberg, and I'm not here to make deals. You see, I don't belong to any financial interest or political party, so I can't bargain or negotiate. I'm only here to once again remind you of the emergency we are in. The crisis that you and your predecessors have created and inflicted upon us. The crisis that you continue to ignore. I am here to remind you of the promises that you have made to your children and grandchildren, and to tell you that we are not willing to compromise on the very minimum safety levels that still remain. The climate and ecological crisis can, unfortunately, no longer be solved within today's systems. According to the current best available science, that's no longer an opinion. That's a fact.
Welcome back, beautiful and amazing human beings. This is Luke Rudowski of WeAreChange.org. A lot of important issues to get in today as Davos 2020 has just officially started. And, oh boy, is there a full frontal push for, of course, the Great Reset, which we are going to be talking about in great detail on this independent media channel, as well as all the latest news. An independent media organization that wants to remind you, just like politicians, scientists are corruptible as well, and many times the professionals have lied to you for the benefit of special interests. Why am I saying that specifically at this time? No reason at all, just an interesting tidbit that I think you should know about. Absolutely no reason at all, as of course very large and powerful secretive institutions remain unaccountable in the United States. Now, jumping in the news, it looks like President Joe Biden is definitely on an executive order signing spree, as he has already signed over 30 executive orders as we speak right now. The number is quickly rising. Also, an interesting thing to note in American politics is that U.S. Senator Ted Cruz just introduced an amendment that would impose term limits to members of Congress. And even though I don't agree with Ted Cruz on a lot of things, I think this is an absolutely smart, brilliant idea that needs to be implemented to actually drain some of that nasty, corroded, disgusting, waste-filled swamp that some people call Washington, D.C. In other parts of the world, they are almost as chaotic as in the United States. This as even local politicians in Holland are warning that the country is headed towards a civil war following many massive protest against, of course, the lockdowns that have been implemented in that country. For the first time since World War II, the Netherlands has actually set up a curfew as they are warning about days or even weeks of unrest as protesters have taken to the streets and even burned down testing facilities in, of course, their anger at the state for shutting down all normal life. Now, the Dutch Prime Minister even came out and warned the rioters that they will be, quote, treated like criminals, and insisted that, quote, 99% of the country is allegedly supporting the curfews. A statement, of course, not backed by any evidence, since it looks like a large majority of the country is out in the middle of the streets rioting against the government. Very interestingly, I'm not seeing any coverage of this in the American mainstream media, but we have to acknowledge what we're seeing in Holland is absolutely significant and soon may be coming to many places around the world, especially in places that lock down their citizens the most. In related bureaucrats thinking they know what's best for the people news, we of course have new news surrounding the, quote, Great Reset, a very generalized term. Now, the World Economic Forum did something very interesting. They're pretty much a conglomerate of bankers, billionaires, corporate heads, and a lot of the other, quote, influencers in mainstream media entertainment society, and they just released the latest propaganda video about their idea of the Great Reset. Now, what's interesting is not the talking points, it's not the vague language, it's not the generalizations of how they want to help you. It's the fact that they actually left the comment section and the like to dislike ratio public so people could actually get a transparent, accountable look to their ideas being contested by everyone out there. And surprisingly, and drumroll, boom, people hate the idea of centralization and more government while giving up their personal freedoms to individuals who created a problem that they're now claiming to solve. Gee, who would have thought? And when you look at the absolute ratio here and the comments, I mean, goodness gracious, they are overwhelmingly doubtful and distrustful of this proposed Great Reset agenda and this latest video that was just released. The first comment, by the way, that has the most likes so far says, quote, the only thing that needs a reset are these traitors of humanity. That's, of course, a public comment by Matt Wren here on this platform. The second is by a user named KV who says, quote, people disenfranchised by a broken system that these people put into place to begin with. The hubris of these people will result in great atrocities guaranteed. The next comment. So basically, give the leaders who brought us to this mess need more power so they can be the solution. No thank you. The next one. Yeah, pretty much that's called communism. Pick up a history book, folks. Another one. You could take this communism and not so kindly shove it where the sun doesn't shine. I mean, I could just keep reading these comments all day. They are very entertaining. And if you want a good laugh, definitely go check them out. You know, and people do bring up some interesting points because when you look at the idea of the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum even described it themselves as people owning nothing, having no privacy, and, quote, living a life better than ever. And if you look at the individuals promoting these ideas, individuals like Bill Gates, one of the world's richest people in history, who, by the way, also just became the #1 owner of farmland in the United States. When you have those individuals lecturing you about how you don't need nothing, I'm sorry, but you're not convincing me there at all. Now, Naomi Klein describes the Great Reset in I think a very fair way, in which she says, quote, in short, the Great Reset encompasses some good stuff that won't happen and some bad stuff that certainly will, and frankly, nothing out of the ordinary in our era of green billionaires readying rockets for Mars. And she's right. When you look at the term Great Reset, again, it's extremely generalized. It's sort of like a northern star for billionaires and globalists and technocrats who want to see an opportunity in every crisis that they could exploit for their own personal benefit. And it's not really a concrete plan or manual set up there. It's literally essentially a set of ideas pushing for more globalization. And Davos and the World Economic Forum have been pushing for these ideas for a long time. In 2009, their big idea was, quote, shaping the post-crisis world. In 2010, it was rethink, redesign, rebuild. In 2012, they said the great transformation. And in 2018, they set out a plan to, quote, creating a shared future in a fractured world. And I think Naomi Klein made a very fair point when she said if Davos wasn't seeking a better form of capitalism to solve the spiraling crisis, Davos itself systematically deepened. It wouldn't be Davos. And she absolutely makes a very fair point that people should hear, especially during the 2021 Davos meeting, which is being held right now virtually. And the theme of it is, quote, a crucial year to rebuild trust, aka holy crap, these people aren't believing us. We're getting ratioed and totally obliterated in the comment section because people are finding out we created the problems that now we're trying to give them the solution for. But I guess maybe they didn't have enough space on the cover board to write all that. I don't know, but to me that's more fair of a theme there than rebuilding trust about the ideas of the Great Reset. Now, the event is being held right now in 430 cities across the world with just very vague language used by extremely powerful individuals pushing an agenda to gain them more power. And let's be honest here, that's essentially what it was. These people are some of the most powerful people in the world because they got there through similar means and ways. Now, for me personally, this is something that should be taken seriously because there is a threat of these people getting their way and essentially pushing a society that is exemplified by modern-day communist China, as of course we are seeing China become more and more influential at the Davos conference, as even the Wall Street Journal released an opinion piece that is titled, Xi Jinping, the president of China, wows them at Davos. With their byline, Chinese president sweet talks liberal leaders as he threatens Taiwan. But let's be honest here, many of these liberal leaders, many of these globalists are envious at the total technocratic authoritarian state that the Chinese government was able to achieve in their country, keeping their citizens under control with a social credit score, organ harvesting, and, genocide. You would think if Davos or the World Economic Forum wanted a better world, they would deal with the genocide of one of their speakers, of the Uyghur Muslim population, but no. We're all going to work together to create a better world as China is becoming more and more influential in shaping it. Now, specifically, what China is calling for here and during this World Economic Forum Davos meeting is a greater role for economic governance, aka the government more involved in the economy, which historically is absolutely disastrous. Central controlling and central planning by governments has led to tremendous economic suffering and instability, and calling for more of it is absolutely naive from a historical perspective. And the Chinese president was very clear that he not only wants central control of the Chinese economy, but also the global economy, as he called for global economic governance. Now, this is, of course, efforts put together by China that are building the Belt and Road Initiative, that are becoming more and more engaged internationally, as, of course, they're looking for global hegemony and global supremacy in the world. Now, what would the world look like with China as the world superpower? Well, a very frightful one, where, of course, any dissent, any critiques would be utterly wiped out. Now, of course, this is not the first time that the Chinese president has outlined his plans for global economic governance or just global governance in itself. And we have to understand China is as powerful as they are mainly because of the support of many billionaires and multinational corporations that have established it to be as powerful as it is right now. Whether it's Nike, Apple, you name it. Many of the companies that you buy from, that you depend on, are literally financing and bankrolling the Chinese state and depending on slaves to produce a lot of those goods. So to have a lot of these heads of these multinational corporations, these billionaires, along with the politicians that they own, fawn over the Chinese government and their plans makes absolutely more sense, as there are even new articles talking about how China is going to take more responsibility in global government. Now, if we're talking about a global government led by China, oh boy, does this signal some troubling times ahead. And of course, a lot of this is being done all in the name of globalization, multilateralism, and they're going to be doing it in a way where it hasn't been done before. As the China Daily even points out, globalization has arrived at a historical tipping point, and I think that is certainly true with the latest technological advancements, which of course the World Economic Forum also sees as a perfect opportunity for, quote, globalization 4.0, or as they are calling it, the fourth industrial revolution, the redefining of capitalism, aka more central planning, more direct government involvement in the free market, eliminating it so you have less choices, less control, less power over yourself, which the great globalist multinational corporations, billionaires, along with their buddies from China who commit genocide, tell you is good for you. It's going to be great not to have any privacy, not to own anything, because life will be never better under the control of genocidal megalomaniacs. Now, this agenda is mainly going to work if people believe in it, if the mainstream media convinces you that giving up your power might be something good for you. Again, just an utter ridiculous idea that is failing in on itself. There's going to be a lot of opportunists trying to take advantage of this situation, trying to push for this. We've seen politicians in India call for this, and politicians in Brazil saying no way, specifically saying no to the Great Reset, which they say, quote, totalitarian social control is not the remedy for any crisis. Those are the comments by Brazil's Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I think this might be one of the few times that a politician actually makes sense.